So, Robert, we've talked about love, sacrifice, benevolence. In a world of compliance, risk, regulation, what do we do?
Right. So, thank you, Laura, and thank you for the inspiration from my fellow two panelists. A couple of years ago, I published a book called Trust Me, PR is Dead. And the reason I published that is because I'd spent 25 years at the top of the public relations industry and quickly came to realize that PR was not part of the solution, but in fact had become part of the problem of trust. And the Edelman Trust Barometer, to which Veronica referred, I contributed to for 6 years. Just before coming up on stage, I tweeted, as a repentant spinner, can anyone trust me? To which James Wilson from the V&A, he's in the room, James, give us a wave, where are you? Yeah, immediately tweeted back, in 20 minutes, we'll tell you. When it comes to relationships, it's interesting. And one of the things I want to talk about is how I think trust is personal and reciprocal and not institutional. I trust Veronica pretty much absolutely. We're friends, we've worked together, we share perspectives. I agree wholeheartedly with her analysis on power and the fact that the age of superhero leadership is dead. CEOs need to leave their capes at the door, I believe is a phrase that Veronica has used. And I think that Veronica agrees with me that PR is dead and is a major trust corroder. Trust needs actions, it doesn't need any more words. Earlier today, we heard from Tom Watson. I mostly trust Tom. Actually, we've been friends on and off for the best part of a decade. We broadly share a political philosophy. We disagree quite, distinctly on some stuff, but that's okay. Disagreements are fine. Disagreements can be trust builders. But Tom is a politician. So there is an immediate conflict between my trust in Tom as an individual and the subset that individual occupies, politics. So as we look to future trust, I'm pretty sure of one thing, that PR is not the answer and nor is politics. But on the subject of politics, I absolutely do not trust the Labour Party or its leader, even though up until recently I was a member. Jeremy Corbyn actually fails on 3 pillars of trustworthiness that Baroness Honora O'Neill gave in her Reith lectures: honesty, competence, reliability. And the Labour Party fails because no longer is it open or adaptive, and it actually displays all the hallmarks of a command and control hierarchy, the pyramid that was referred to earlier. And like so many institutions that were born in the 20th century, it's no longer fit for purpose in a collaborative, networked, or digital age. We learned from Antonio Gramsci that, there is something called the interregnum, and that is what we're now living through. The old is not yet dead, and the new has still to be born. And Gramsci wrote that in the interregnum, we will see signs or morbid symptoms. And I think, as Margaret said this morning, we don't yet know what the trust future looks like, but we need to live in the meantime with the morbid symptoms that the old and the dying is still displaying. And I would say that Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn are both morbid symptoms. So Laura's question to me was about risk, was about compliance, was about bureaucracy. And my answer to Laura and to you is that we need to think differently about risk if we're going to move to a positive trust future. We need to think differently about compliance. We need to think differently about leaders and organizations. And we need to think differently fundamentally about trust. So let's look at those in turn. By the way, the clock says 4 minutes, but I haven't been speaking for 6. So someone's cheating somewhere. Anyway, I can't trust the clock. Can we reset the clock to a fair time? Anyway, first, risk. I think we've spent the best part of half a century trying to control risk and to dictate terms, to dictate the future from the top down. I think this is wrong, and this is what has led us into these fragile times. And no longer should any leader rely on dull, controlling managerialism, message management, CSR, or spin. It's bullshit. It's over. But as Veronica said, that system is what led to the rise of Brexit and of Trump. It came from a generation of leaders basically spewing bullshit platitudes that no one believed and unable to say sorry because their lawyers or their PR people guarded them against saying so. That is wrong. So leaders need to make themselves as vulnerable to their employees, to their customers, to their stakeholders, as those groups have traditionally been to them. And dissent is welcome, because when it comes to listening, if we don't listen, we cannot learn. Dissent is a productive force in building trust. So in my world, those who give up control, who relinquish control, who open themselves to risk, actually end up being more trusted. KPMG is one of the supporters of this program, and the work that we've done with them on responsible tax is a good case in point. Secondly, compliance. Compliance is a huge part of the trust problem. An obsession with measurement is wrong. Compliance is a hindrance to the public or common good. And doing what is lawful does not mean that you are doing what is right. So we need to have an honest conversation about ethics and morality in business today. We have to stop imposing corporate bureaucracy and start co-producing human frameworks, which is what the CIPD is doing, around human principles that put the common good front and centre. Margaret has written far more eloquently than I that we must stop measuring everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And we need to think in terms of accountability instead. And I'd urge you to go out and buy, if she's not selling it here, Margaret's book, Beyond Measure. So establishing frameworks of principles that go over compliance and talk about human principles is what we need to do. The third area we need to look at is leaders and organizations. And ultimately, I've written many times that the crisis of trust is really nothing more than a crisis of leadership. I think we need to think about our leaders, or we need to help them become activists. We need to think in terms of the activist leaders. I think activist leaders need to think about themselves as activists, but their organizations as social movements. And actually, if they'd listened to the message of Occupy in 2010, 2011, we are the 99%, recognize what movements can do to be productive forces for good, then they would have changed their thinking. Instead, they ignored, to use Veronica's eloquent terms, the disheveled and the dirty. So activist leadership is long overdue, but of course in our world we're terrified of an activist CEO. My God, keep your head beneath the parapet, man. And it usually is man. And it's time to get your head above the parapet, to stand for something. It's okay to have a point of view. It's okay to challenge. Leaders have to, if they are to be more trusted, deal with the real issues of our time. Social inclusion, social justice, affordability, shelter, climate change, inclusion. And they have to deal with it in a real way, not through bullshit platitudes that I referenced earlier or through completely nonsense CSR. They have to think, and you have to think about how can we leave here and build a network of people who believe what we believe. Co-workers acting together in new ecosystems of organizations, and it can be powered by digital. And this is where we can trust or place our trust in the future, in real people with a real commitment, just as we want to commit ourselves. And then fifth, trust. We have to think about trust differently. In fact, we may need to stop thinking about trust altogether and start thinking about trustworthiness. And I know that sounds like a pedantic semantic term. But trust is a knackered word, right? It's been used and abused by politicians and business leaders for way too long. And actually asking that we want more trust, as somebody mentioned earlier, whether it's from a politician or a former PR person or an estate agent or a lawyer, asking for more trust may be nonsense anyway. So therefore, we have to think about trustworthiness instead. There is no reason why we should think about trust in institutions, in politics, business, or civil society. The digital age has blown open that myth of institutional trust. You know, do the right thing or they will get you. Whistleblowers are everywhere. Command and control hierarchies no longer work. Radical honesty and radical transparency is what is needed. So actually, you go back to Nora O'Neill's 3 points about trustworthy behavior. Honesty, competence, reliability. Business trust is personal and it's reciprocal. So I'm going to use the 1 minute that it cheated for me on the clock to wrap up very quickly and ask the question, so what is the advice? If we want to move into a more trusted, more trustworthy future, we have to actively embrace all the stuff that we have been trained for the best part of 30 or 50 years, and we have to go against that. Sorry, we have to actively embrace all the stuff we've been trained to reject or contain. Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century political theorist, wrote, "To live in freedom, one must grow used to a life full of agitation, change, and danger." And I think that's a very poignant quote. That actually to be trusted tomorrow, We need to embrace agitation. We need to embrace change. We need to embrace danger, because that is what will build, not weaken, resilience and trust. So going back to my earlier point, business leaders need to make themselves as vulnerable to their employees, their customers, their co-workers, their stakeholders, their regulators, as those people have traditionally been to them, and they have to be accountable for it. In my book, I call this standing naked. And every CEO should ask himself or herself the question of their organization, am I prepared to stand naked and be accountable for my actions? So co-produce strategies and solutions, build a generative dialogue, relearn the ability to say sorry, be open, adaptive, and creative. And remember, it is not all about the money. People and planet are more important than profit. You will be more trusted if you enable human potential to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I guess I'm left wondering, are we trying to square a circle as leaders? Because we know how important it is to demonstrate ourselves as competent in our roles. So that's one of the things that research tells us, isn't it? You've got to be competent. But on the other hand, we want to show our vulnerability. So how does that work?
Well, you know, it's a point that Veronica and Margaret have both written out previously about this sort of several generations of leaders who've had to sort of ironclad themselves and not be vulnerable. And I think one of the problems we have is this sort of lingering Harvard Business School orthodoxy around less is more. You know, part of my epiphany when I quit my job as chief executive at Edelman was the fact that I went to the board and said, look, we have to tell the world, you know, this is a chaotic and complex place. We have to embrace chaos. And they went, hey, Rob, chaos doesn't sell. Simplicity sells. And it's like, this is not about sales bullshit any longer, right? We have to recognize the world as it is. And the world as it is means that we have to be honest. That's why it's about being radically honest and radically transparent. And we have to demonstrate vulnerability. I mean, I've been researching this for the best part of 10 years now, but one of the people that gave me the best piece of advice ever was Lord Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And I am not someone who has faith. I am a self-professed atheist Jew, so I have no skin in the game with Rowan. But he said, you know, Robert, don't you find it terribly annoying when someone just says to you, I'm terribly sorry that you feel like that, when you just want them to say a proper sorry? And I thought that was one of those powerful, insightful things about business. Why is it in business and in politics, people can't just say, sorry, I fucked up? Right? Sorry, I was wrong. You know, sorry, we will learn from these mistakes and we will move on. And that's because, to the vulnerability point, they want to hold on to the power point and not ready to let go.
Thank you.